North Park readers, Mrs. Bussert here. I'm going to be reading with you chapter 14 of Stuart Little. The chapter is called An Evening on the River, and this is the very first page. Before we start, let's go over this week's wow word, which is ballasted. And this week's Tuesday, Tell Me Tuesday question is, how many shirts did Stuart go through, and why did he go through so many? When we get to the wow word and to the area of the book where you might be able to answer this question, I might slow down and talk to you a little bit about it, but I say we get started. So chapter 14, An Evening on the River, is on page 113, and I say we get started. Maybe get into your favorite chair, grab a drink of water, and cozy up, and let's read together. An Evening on the River. When Stuart arrived at his campsite by the river, he was tired and hot. He put the canoe on the water and was sorry to see that it leaked badly. The birch bark at the stern was held together by a lacing, and the water came through the seam. In a very few seconds, the canoe was half full with water. "Darn it," said Stuart. "I've been swindled." He had paid 76 cents for a genuine Indian birch bark canoe, only to find that it leaked. "Darn, darn, darn," he muttered. Then he bailed out his canoe and hauled it up onto the beach for repairs. He knew he couldn't take Harriet out on a leaky boat. She wouldn't like it. Tired though he was, he climbed a spruce tree and found some spruce gum. With this, he plugged the seam and stopped the leak. Even so, the canoe turned out to be a cranky little craft. If Stuart had not had plenty of experience on the water, he wouldn't have gotten into serious trouble with it. It was a tippy boat, even for a souvenir. Stuart carried some stones from the beach down to the water's edge and ballasted the canoe with the stones until it floated evenly and steadily. Did you notice that the word ballasted came up, which is this week's wordly wow or wow word? So I'm going to read that sentence again, and let's see if we can kind of figure out what it means. The boat was tippy, even for a souvenir. Stuart carried stones from the beach down towards the water's edge and ballasted the canoe with the stones until it floated evenly and steadily. So before he ballasted the canoe, it was tippy, and then after, it was even and steady. So I wonder what that word can mean by context of the sentence. Let's move on. He made a backrest so that Harriet would be able to lean back and trail her fingers on the water if she wished. He also made a pillow by tying one of his clean handkerchiefs around some moss. Then he went for a paddle practice his strokes. He was angry that he didn't have anything better than a paper spoon to paddle, but he decided that there was nothing he can do about it. He wondered whether Harriet would notice that his paddle was really just an ice cream spoon. All that afternoon, Stuart worked on the canoe, adjusting ballast, filling seams, and getting everything shipshape for tomorrow. He could think of nothing but his date with Harriet, and at supper time, he took an axe, felled a dandelion, opened a can of deviled ham, and had a light supper of ham and dandelion milk. After supper, he propped himself up against a fern, bit off some spruce gum for a chew, and lay there on the bank dreaming of chewing gum. In his imagination, he went over every detail of tomorrow's trip with Harriet. With his eyes shut, he seemed to see, and turn the page, the whole occasion plainly. How he would look when she came down the path to the water, how calm and peaceful the river was going to be in the twilight, how graceful the canoe would seem drawn up on the shore. In imagination, he lived every minute of their evening together. They would paddle to a large water lily pad upstream, and he would invite Harriet to step out on the pad and sit a while. Stuart planned to wear his swimming trunks under his clothes so that he could dive off lily pads into the cool stream. He would swim the crawl stroke up and down and all around the lily pad while Harriet watched, admiring his ability as a swimmer. Stuart chewed the spruce gum very rapidly as he thought about this part of the episode. Suddenly, Stuart opened his eyes and sat up. He thought about the letter he had sent, and he wondered whether it had even been delivered. It was an unusually small letter, of course, and might have gone unnoticed in the letterbox. This idea filled him with fears and worries, but soon he let his thoughts return to the river And as he lay there in a whirlpool, and a whippoorwill began to sing on the opposite shores. Darkness spread over the land, and Stuart dropped off to sleep. The next day dawned cloudy. Stuart had to go up to the village to have an oil change in his car, so he hid the canoe under some leaves, tied it firmly to a stone, and went off on his errand. Still thinking about Harriet and wishing it were a nicer day, the sky looked rainy. Stuart returned from the village with a headache, but he hoped it would be better before 5 o'clock. He felt rather nervous, as he had never taken a girl canoeing before. He spent the afternoon lying around camp trying on different shirts to see which one looked best on him and combing his whiskers. He would no sooner get a clean shirt on than he would discover that it was wet under the arms from nervous perspiration, and he would have to change it for a dry one. So this part is probably where they're going to be answering the Tell Me Tuesday question, which is how many shirts did Stuart go through and why did he go through so many? So I'm going to kind of go back to the previous page and start this over so you can start thinking about the question. So he would, let's go back to, he spent the afternoon lying around camp trying on different shirts to see which looked best on him and combing his whiskers. He would no sooner get a clean shirt on that he would discover that it was wet under the arms from nervous perspiration. That kind of means like you're wet under the arms or you're sweating. And he would have to change it for a dry one. He put on a clean shirt at 2 o'clock, then another one at 3 o'clock, and another one at 4:15. This took up most of the afternoon. As 5 o'clock drew near, Stuart grew more and more nervous. He kept looking at his watch and glancing up at the path, combing his hair and talking to himself and fidgeting. The day had turned chilly, and Stuart was almost sure that there was going to be rain. He couldn't imagine what he would do if it should rain, just as Harriet Ames showed up to go canoeing. At last, 5 o'clock arrived. Stuart heard someone coming down the path, and it was Harriet. She had accepted his invitation. Stuart threw himself down against a stump and tried to strike an easy conversation as though he were accustomed to taking girls out. He waited till Harriet was within a few feet of him, then got up. "Hello there," he said, trying to keep his voice from trembling. "Are you Mr. Little?" asked Harriet. "Yes," said Stuart. "It's nice to meet you. It's nice of you to come." "Well, it was very good of you to ask me," replied Harriet. She was wearing a white sweater, a tweed skirt, short white wool socks, and sneakers. Her hair was tied with bright-colored handkerchief, and Stuart noticed that she carried a box of peppermints in her hand. "Not at all. Glad to do it," said Stuart. Now, that description of Harriet, I feel like that would kind of be an interesting drawing. So I think this week, maybe when you're thinking about what you want to draw, look at some of the paragraphs, and if there's anything descriptive, like Harriet wearing a white sweater, a tweed skirt, short white wool socks, and sneakers, and her hair was tied with a bright colored handkerchief, that could be kind of interesting to think about how to illustrate or draw for the book. "Not at all." Now I'm going to go right back to this part. "Not at all. Glad to do it," said Stuart. "I only wish we had better weather. Looks rather sticky, don't you think?" Stuart was trying to make his voice sound as though he had an English accent. And Harriet looked at the sky and nodded. "Oh well," she said, "if it rains, it rains." "Sure," repeated Stuart. "If it rains, it rains. My canoe is a short distance up the shore. May I help you over the rough places in the path?" Stuart was courteous mouse by nature, but Harriet said she didn't need any help. She was an active girl and not at all inclined to stumble or fall. Stuart led the way to where he had hidden the canoe, and Harriet followed. But when they reached the spot, Stuart was horrified to discover that the canoe was not there. It had disappeared. Stuart's heart sank, and he felt like crying. "The canoe is gone," he groaned. Then he began racing wildly up and down the bank, looking everywhere. Harriet joined in the search, and after a while they found the canoe. But it was a mess. Someone had been playing with it. A long piece of heavy string was tied to one end. The ballast rocks were gone. The pillow was gone. The backrest was gone. The spruce gum had come out of the seam. Mud was all over everything, and one of the paddles was bent and twisted. It was just a mess. It looked just the way a birch bark canoe looks after some big boys, are finished playing with it. Stuart was heartbroken. He did not know what to do. He sat down on a twig and buried his head in his hands. "Oh gee," he kept saying. "Oh gee whiz." Page 122. "What's the trouble?" asked Harriet. "Miss Ames," said Stuart in a trembling voice, "I assure you I had everything beautifully arranged. Everything. And now look." Harriet was for fixing the canoe up and going on the river anyway, but Stuart couldn't stand that idea. "It's no use," he said bitterly. "It wouldn't be the same." "The same as what?" asked Harriet. "The same as the way it was going to be, when I was thinking about it yesterday. I'm afraid a woman can't understand these things. Look at that string." Did you hear that sentence? "Well, it's tied on so tight, I could never get it off." "Well," suggested Harriet, "couldn't we just let it hang over in the water and trail along after us?" Stuart looked at her in despair. "Did you ever see an Indian paddling along some quiet, unspoiled river with a great big piece of rope dragging astern?" he asked. "Well, we could pretend we were fishing," said Harriet, who didn't realize that some people are fussy about boats. "I don't want to pretend I'm fishing," cried Stuart desperately. "Besides, look at that mud! Look at it!" He was screaming now. Harriet sat down on the twig beside Stuart. She offered him a peppermint, but he shook his head. "Well," she said, "it's starting to rain, and I guess I'd better be running along if you're not going to take me paddling in your canoe. I don't see why you have to sit here and sulk. Would you like to come up to my house? After dinner, you can take me to the dance at the country club. It might cheer you up." "No, thank you," replied Stuart. "I don't know how to dance. Besides, I plan to make an early start in the morning. I'll probably be on the road by daybreak." "Are you going to sleep out in this rain?" asked Harriet. "Certainly," said Stuart. "I'll crawl under the canoe." Harriet shrugged her shoulders. "Well," she said, "goodbye, Mr. Little." "Goodbye, Miss Ames," said Stuart. "I'm sorry our evening on the river had to end like this." "So am I," said Harriet, and she walked away along the wet path toward Tracy's Lane, leaving Stuart alone with his broken dreams and his damaged canoe. And that was the end of chapter 14. We just have one more chapter left. This book has been so wonderful so far. Okay, talk to you later. Bye.